Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're going to look at something a little bit different than my usual fare. These are some of the strangest and most interesting game books that I've ever looked at. This is White Warlord and Black Baron. They're part of the Combat Heroes series of books created by Joe Dever. And these are two books that go together with each other. We'll see why in just a second. The author is the creator of the Lone Wolf series of solo game books, which I have not actually played, but I have heard a lot about. What's interesting about these is they are not solo game books. These are player versus player, first-person shooter dungeon combat games where two players are going to be acting as characters inside a dungeon, hunting each other down and fighting them from a first-person perspective. It's hard to describe that unless you just take a look at the actual pictures themselves. As you can see inside this book, you're traveling around, and every once in a while you get a glimpse of your enemy. So there's a picture where you can't see him, and then eventually if you stalk up on him, maybe you can come right up to face-to-face with him and engage in hand-to-hand combat. And over here, you're trying to stalk him again. And there's little instructions down here for moving through this dungeon. Very strange if you haven't seen something like this before. This whole concept for a kind of first-person shooter in a book came from originally a different series called Ace of Aces. This was a World War I dogfight simulator. One player was in a German plane, one was in an Ally plane, and very similar if you take a look at it. So you can see where the enemy plane is, and then there's little instructions down here on how to maneuver and try and shoot them down and get points. However, this channel is focused on D&D stuff, so I figured I would take a look at the Combat Heroes line, which took this idea and adapted it more for a D&D-like audience. Now, these books are a bit older. I think they came out in 1986, so you have to get them in used form if you want to play it, but I will put links down in the description as usual for where I picked these up in case you want to as well. Before we dig into the mechanics of how this whole thing works, though, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Dark Places and Demogorgons for Old School Essentials, now available on Kickstarter. In it, you play high schoolers from a small town in the 1980s, investigating strange occurrences and trying to stop them for good. The book includes 20 new classes, 30 new 80s-themed spells, 20 psionic powers, and a modern equipment list. In addition, the Cryptid Manual is packed with modern American monsters to bedevil your players, like Sasquatch, Chupacabra, the Greys, and tons more. Check it out on Kickstarter, along with those amazing Hankerin Furnail covers, using the link in the description below. All right, let's take a look and see what we get inside here. I'll just be focusing on the White Warlord book. They're essentially the same book. The main difference is just that when you see your enemy, it'll look different. So if you're the White Warlord character, you'll see the Black Baron character when you're running around the dungeon, and vice versa for this one. So they're pretty much the same. You just need two books in order to do a two-player game. So let's just take a look at this. Now, the general concept here, so I'll jump right into the actual rules here, is you can start on a couple different places. So it says right here at the beginning, you can start on numbers 1, 31, or 41. And those are referring to these numbers at the top of this page right here. So you could start at number 1. Let's go to number 1 right here. And this just shows you what you see. At the same time as you are doing this, the other player is finding his starting page in the Black Baron book. And then what we're going to do is each turn goes through 3 phases, where first you move, and then you can shoot if your opponent is visible, and then you can get into melee combat, again, if you are visible to your enemy and you are in close range. However, a good deal of the game is really just traveling around the map trying to track down your enemy, or perhaps lying in wait for them. So your basic moves here is you can either turn or hide or move. And you have 4 different options for turn. That just means turn left. That means turn right. That means turn around, so you're facing backwards. And this one means stay standing still, facing in the same direction. Basically just hold and wait for the next turn. Over here, we have different moves. Move forward, move left. So this would really mean kind of turn left and then move forward. Move right, back up while facing the same direction. This one is only really available when you are in close combat and you're going to try and retreat from close combat. This one would be move forward and go left, or move forward and go right. What you might notice here is that there's numbers down below, but a lot of them are blank. If they're blank, then you really can't take that move. So here, for example, you can't turn around and face the other way because there's a blank wall behind you. So why would you want to do that? In this case, you can only stay still, you can look to the right, you can move forward, or you can turn and move right. You can also hide. As you can see here, there's an arrow pointing to hiding behind this statue, but the rules for that are a little bit more complex, and we'll skip that for the time being. What you're going to do is choose your move for the move phase of the turn, and your opponent does the same thing. Then you both, at the same time, read out the number shown below it. Let's say, for example, that I want to move forward. I would call out 146, and my opponent would call out whatever his number was. What I would do first is listen to my opponent's number and check right here in this section below 146. If any of these top 3 numbers was the number that he called out, then instead of turning to page 146, I would turn to one of these 3 pages down here. So if he called out 170, I would turn to 114 to see what the next page would look like. However, if the number he calls out is not one of these 3 numbers, I would just turn to page 146. Whenever you get a number here that is the number your opponent called, that means that you're going to be able to see him. These are the page numbers down here where he would be visible. So for example, if he calls out his number and it's not one of these, I just go to 146, flip to that particular page, and I get my new view of what I see. I've now moved past that statue and I'm just a little bit further down the passage. Now I can use this move, turn forward and go right if I want to. However, if my opponent called out 170, then I would say, oh, look, down below that we have 114. So I would turn to page 114, and then we should be able to see him at this point. And there he is. He probably ran around the corner and came down towards us, and now we're at close range. In fact, we're at range 1, which is just outside of melee range, and we could shoot bows at each other if that's what we had in our hands. Probably a good portion of this game, at least in the early game when you're not familiar with it, is going to be running around this dungeon, exploring it so you get a sense of the layout. And at first it feels like this complex, labyrinthine maze that you're never going to fully understand. But I spent a little bit flipping through the book just to map it out for myself. And the actual layout of this dungeon looks like this. It's extremely simple. It's essentially 2 loops. With this dead space in the middle. You can't move into that space. So you can travel around here in this kind of figure 8 pattern. And there's a number of landmarks like rubble, sacks, a font, a throne, a barrel, and a statue that can help you orient yourself. Now, at first, you might be thinking, this is kind of a lame dungeon. You want a big, expansive dungeon with all sorts of weird, hidden corners and secret passages and stuff. The problem is, though, that this is a 1 versus 1 combat game. In a big, complex dungeon, you would spend most of the game never finding each other. In fact, you could possibly go on for hours with never seeing each other. So you need a fairly confined space to make sure that you're going to be running into each other before too long. I find it a little bit strange that the books themselves don't actually give you this map. The map is pretty simple, and like I said, after a game or 2, you're going to figure this out for yourself. So I don't know why I wouldn't just give it to you so you can begin planning and using it strategically, which I think is the intent. All right, but how does actual combat work? In order to figure that out, we need to turn to the front of the book where we can see the character sheet. That's right, there is a character sheet. So there's actually 2 character sheets. There's one for the 2-person combat game, which I'm explaining right now. And there's also a solo version of it, which I'll talk about at the end of this video. But here is your main combat sheet that you're going to be using. You have a combat skill rating that starts at 16, actually. It can go up and it can go down because this is intended to be played as a kind of campaign where you run multiple matches against an opponent and your stats can go up and down over time, making it more like a role-playing game, although one that's just focused on combat. You have endurance points here, basically your hit points. You have the weapons that you start off with here and the weapons that you're currently carrying in your hand. What I would probably do is photocopy this, make copies of it, and I would actually laminate it and then use expo markers or dry erase markers so that I could mark things and change things really quickly, because you are going to be marking this up a lot and changing things around. Like the weapon that's currently in your hand, that can be switched up. So you're going to have to be erasing a circle and then writing new circles quite a few times. You have different status down here that could be caused by critical hits, because there is narrative critical hits that can happen if you take enough damage. You can track your arrows right here. Here's your starting pages, and mark whether your bow is loaded or not. It's a little bit detailed as far as these types of game books go, which are often very simplified. So when you're able to shoot someone, they're in your sights and you're holding your bow, you're going to turn to this page, the bow fire grid. What you're going to do is find your current combat skill. Like I said, it starts at 16. So you're going to look at this column really, although that can change over the course of a campaign. And then what's going to happen is you're going to call out a number between 1 and 10, and your opponent will as well. And you're both going to do this at the same time. That will semi-randomly generate a number between 2 and 20. And then you simply look at the result to see what happens. If it's a number, then that's how much damage that you do to them, and you reduce their endurance points. If it's an M, then it's a miss. And if it's a star, then it is a critical hit. And you can go to critical hit tables. Now, there are modifiers involved here as well. So if you are farther away from someone, if you're at range 2, then you move 1 column to the left, because that's a worse column. If you're at range 3, you move 2 columns to the left. As you can see, if you examine this, the further you go to the right, the less M's or misses there are in that column. So going to the right is generally better. Other modifiers include if there's partial obstruction, like they're hiding behind something, then you get a penalty. But if you stayed still and didn't move at all last turn, like basically you're aiming, you get a bonus. And if you were unaware of your opponent last round, then you get a penalty. So there's a bunch of different ways that this can shake up. It does get a little complicated for something that you're just flipping through a book for. I can think of ways that you could simplify all of these rules just to make it faster and require a little bit less fiddliness, but it's really not too much of a struggle. I was playing this with my 7-year-old and we didn't really have too much of a trouble following it. Once you have shot at your enemy, they can take a shot back at you. Whoever has the higher combat skill gets to shoot first, and if that kills their opponent, then obviously they don't get to shoot back. However, it works a little bit differently over in the combat grid. So this is for melee combat. How things work here is, well, the rules are a little bit similar. You and your opponent both call out a number between 1 and 10, and that gives you a result here. So let's say that you are attacking your opponent. Let's say you have the higher combat skill, so you're going to be striking first in the melee phase, and you call out 5, and they call out 2. So you would have 5, 2, ooh, you're doing 4 damage. Now the thing is that if you are the first person to strike during the melee phase, you actually deal double damage. So you would deal 8 damage instead of 4. That's really, really good. In melee combat, having a higher combat skill means that you are more likely to strike first, which means that you're going to be dealing twice as much damage during the first round of combat, and you're going to be winning more quickly. There's some fun critical hit charts here as well. So if you roll a critical hit in normal combat, you could have a gashed left bicep. So you lose 5 endurance, no use of a bow for 5 game rounds. So it's a little bit of tracking there involved, but it simulates a little bit more of reality. Or perhaps a thigh wound, -5 endurance, no movement or turning for 1 game round. That's a big problem because then you can't escape. Your opponent could possibly back off and then just start shooting arrows at you because you wouldn't be able to escape. Things could be as bad as a punctured heart where simply death is instantaneous. Same thing goes for the bow. You could have an arrow in your shoulder, you could be hit in the head, an arrow in your left thigh, piercing your hips, pierces your upper chest, or again, punctures heart. Death is instantaneous. Your stats are going to be shifting over time with these critical hits, altering the flow of combat and who has the upper hand. Other rules in here include loading your bow, because every time you shoot, you have to spend a whole round loading up another arrow. And you also have to spend a round changing carried weapons, although you are allowed to move while you're doing that. So you could be firing at someone with a bow, and then you might have to switch to a sword in order to attack them. Or you could be stalking someone with a bow, but maybe they ambush you and you don't have your sword out, and now you're in trouble. There's also rules for hiding right here, which are a little bit fiddly, because there's a slightly different rules for how they work, although it's spelled out pretty clear here, where you can hide behind obstructions like this and then jump out at opponents and hit them from close range, which is always really good. However, if you're just hiding behind here, the opponent could come down the hallway behind you because of the structure of the dungeon, which is all made up of loops, and that could put you at a serious disadvantage. Page 6 right here is an example of you sneaking up on an opponent who is hiding behind this statue, and get ready to stab him in the back. Another fun thing that you can do is you can stalk opponents. So if your opponent is traveling down a corridor and you see his back view, you can start following after him and he won't be aware that you're there. If you manage to catch up to him without him being aware of you, then again, you can do an ambush and possibly get a lot of damage in. There are rules here for capturing and surrendering the game, which often happens when players don't want their character to be killed, because it is assumed to be a campaign game where you play multiple games and then slowly grow in power over time. However, I'm betting that this doesn't happen too often. It's not the sort of game that you would just play over and over in the same night. Maybe you would spread it out over several weeks. It's really more of a one-shot type game. It's something that you could hand off to your kids during a road trip and they could play it in the car. It's something that you could play in line at a convention or something like that. As long as you had little character sheets that you could slide in here like bookmarks that you could scribble on. Depending on how the game ends up and the different achievements that you get, you can increase your combat skill and endurance, or perhaps lose some of those if you had a very poor showing. I like how as the campaign goes on, your total combat skill of your character is going to give you different titles, which is very similar to what we see in old school D&D, so that's a fun little reference. You can get all the way up to Combat Hero if you're at level 36 or higher. Now, if you don't happen to have another player to play with, or you only own one of the books, never fear, there is an entire second game built into this just for solo play. And all of the pages for solo play are kind of interweaved into the other pages just to scramble things up a bit, so that you don't see any spoilers. So you start on page 7 for this, and all you can do is move forward, turn left, turn right, or move back. There's only 4 different things that you can do. And in this solo game, you're not tracking down another player. Instead, you're trying to solve a mystery of a labyrinth. Now, I haven't actually broken down this labyrinth. I'm pretty sure that it is not quite the same structure as we've seen before with that figure 8 pattern. It might be. I haven't actually figured that out for myself, but I don't think that it is. What you're doing is you're exploring this environment and you're simply trying to find a number of magic items, and that each magic item will help you open another magic case or a door that will get you another magic item, and you go through the whole dungeon and try and open everything up and escape without being killed by a bunch of interesting traps. It strikes me as the sort of game that you're going to have to play a whole bunch of times to figure out where the traps are, what direction you have to approach them from, and so on. Every once in a while, you may come across a page like this where you find an interesting object where you can turn right or go back, but this one has an X in front of its number. You have X50. So that is not an actual page number. That means you actually turn to a section at the back where you get more information. So X50 would say, here it is, the top of this urn is sealed off and chiseled below is a standard inscription. You read the inscription and then you can make choices that would tell you what page to go to. So this makes it essentially a very visual, very open, choose your own adventure type of novel. And I think it's a lot of fun. It reminds me a lot of those Myst games. It's a point and click adventure essentially. You're clicking around through a dungeon, gathering items, using them on other items, and trying to escape without dying. Here's the character sheet that you would use for solo play. All you really need to keep track of is which items you've currently found and what your endurance is, which can be reduced by traps. Now, if you use the Black Baron book, like I said, this is the companion book, and it's essentially the same, except that it does have a different solo adventure. The solo adventure is the same structure. You're exploring a maze, you're trying to find all these magic items, but it's not the same maze. So it gives a little bit more variety once you've beaten the first one. So that's White Warlord and Black Baron by Joe Dever. It's a crazy concept that I hadn't seen anywhere before apart from Ace of Aces. I had no idea that there was a fantasy version of this until I ran into it on Wikipedia and I knew I had to pick it up. I had a lot of fun testing this out with my son, and I bet a lot of other people would too. I love the design of the books. I love the originality. I love how every single one of these pages is handwritten. I think even all of the numbers are handwritten. Like, the numbers, you can tell, are slightly different each time. So there's a guy going through writing all of these numbers in by hand for every page. It feels like an old illuminated manuscript, except that it's also a first-person shooter released years before Doom or any of the other actual video game first-person shooters existed. I think this would be really fun as kind of a novelty session that you threw into a D&D campaign, where if a character enters a city and wants to fight in the arenas or wants to fight in the fighting pits, you could pull out these books and say, you have to fight the champion of the city, and then quickly explain to them the basic rules of this game, and then just start playing in this first-person mode. It would blow people's minds. As usual, links are in the description below for where you can pick these up for yourself if you're so inclined, and thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.